Anyone who's trying to raise their awareness about exposure and hoping to build up experience should consider using manual exposure for a while. And the reasons are this. If I use my satellite navigation to find my way to a place I need to visit, and then I need to return to the same place 2 weeks later, I need my satellite navigation again. Now, because I made that journey on automatic, so to speak, I never paid enough attention to the route. Now, I've used this analogy for some years, but only recently I saw that a study has been published that actually supports the fact that we're all pretty much the same. When we make a journey using a map and we plan it, then we tend to remember it, but when we use SatNav, we don't. So if you use automatic exposure in your camera, then you're doing much the same. If you switch to a manual exposure, even for a couple of months, you're going to see that exposure actually is quite predictable most of the time. And I do have a video in this set called Exposure, Mystery or Predictable. So when I suggest that we use manual exposure, what do I mean exactly? I mean that we, the user, take over control of all three exposure modes: ISO, shutter speed and aperture. But we still do make use of the camera's exposure meter to tell us what settings we need to apply. So first we need to find out how to set the camera to manual, and then what two buttons or controls on our camera will affect the shutter and the aperture. As an example, the Canon camera we show here controls the shutter from the small wheel close to the shutter button, which is quite logical when you think about it, and the apertures are adjusted via the large dial on the back of the camera. When we have the camera up to our eye, both of these controls fall very nicely to the right forefinger and also the right thumb. Looking down at the settings for this particular picture, I'm going to leave the ISO set to 100 for now. It's the other two settings I'd like to concentrate on first, the aperture and the shutter. So as we raise the camera to our eye, we have all the information in the viewfinder at our fingertips. The shutter speed is set to a 60th of a second and the aperture is set to f4. The exposure scale that we can see down in the bottom center is telling us that if we take the shot now, the shot is going to be 2 stops overexposed. So we've got to reduce the exposure by 2 stops. So I suppose the question we may want to ask is, what is the most important here? Is it the shutter or the aperture to make those changes? Well, with this particular image, neither seems to be critical. So let's reduce the aperture to 5.6, and that has brought our pointer 1 stop closer to the correct exposure. And if we increase the shutter speed 1 stop to 125th of a second, that tells us we're ready to take the shot. In effect, we've done nothing here which is different to what would have happened if we'd used one of the automatic exposure settings our camera offers. But because we set this one manually, we tend to remember more and learn more. Sometimes we find ourselves in much lower light conditions, and then we have a common problem. The exposure scale tells us that at a 15th of a second shutter and f4, we're going to be 2 stops underexposed if we take the shot now. We need to find 2 stops of light, but our aperture is already at its widest setting. We can't get any more light in that way. We don't have our tripod with us, so we cannot reduce the shutter speed slower than a 15th of a second. it would be touch and go whether we were able to capture a sharp shot at a 15th of a second with a 24mm lens that was used. We are very likely to get some camera shake. We've only really got one choice, and that's to increase the ISO. We know that if we increase the ISO considerably, we may start to introduce unwanted noise into our photo, but better to get a sharp shot with a little bit of noise that maybe we can do something about in our image editor, rather than capturing an unsharp image. So here we can increase the ISO from 100 to 200. That allows us to lift the shutter speed from a 15th of a second to a 30th of a second. So we're already in a better position to get a shot here. But if we move the ISO to 400, then we can lift that shutter to a 60th of a second, and using a 24mm lens, we should be fine to take our shot. And we can see that the exposure scale pointer is telling us we're now correct. I have just a short story to end this section. A couple of years ago, I had a camera converted to shoot infrared black and white images. And the conversion means that we cannot use the camera's light meter because it wasn't really designed for invisible light, which is what infrared is. After a little bit of practice and trial and error, I have discovered that one of the best settings to use is 200 ISO and f8. So most of the exposures I make with my infrared camera are done using the shutter speed only. In the time that I've had this camera, I've found that the vast majority of exposures I make are either a 60th of a second at f8 with 200 ISO or 125th of a second at f8 with 200 ISO. Very rarely do I need to increase shutter speed to 250th of a second. Now this may be an infrared camera, but the exposure principles are exactly the same, and as I'm trying to say here, they're largely predictable. But you need to be using a manual exposure to really appreciate this.